I want to wish a good evening to everybody, and thank you so much for joining us at the New Hampshire Network for Environment, Energy, and Climate for our first pre-election fireside conversation 2022. With all the election buzz, debates, et cetera, we thought it would be beneficial and nice to give grant staters who are concerned about the present and the future of our common environment a chance to hear from some prominent candidates about their objectives and goals for the next few years, and to do it in a more relaxed venue context. So the idea here is to simply carry on a multi-way conversation with our three guest legislators and prospective policymakers, exploring what they see as the main priorities for New Hampshire's environment, what are the biggest obstacles to enacting those priorities, and best ways of overcoming those obstacles. We, the New Hampshire Network, is a nonpartisan organization in the sense that we don't make specific endorsements for office. In that spirit, we've also reached out to Governor Sununu's campaign and to several colleagues on that side of the aisle to invite them to do a similar pre-election event on environment, energy, and climate. We haven't heard back yet. But it is a real pleasure to have with us this evening three State House stalwarts on environmental issues who are currently in the throes of campaigning for election or re-election to the House, the Senate, and the corner office of New Hampshire. They're well known to many of you, and in just a moment, I'll introduce all three guests and also our several co-moderators for the event. But first, I want to remind everybody that we are meeting on Ndakina territory, the ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples who have stewarded these lands and these waterways over many generations. And a second reminder is that we are in meeting mode here, so please keep your mute button on so that we don't get weird echoes and other auditory disturbances. And now I would like to turn to tonight's guests. First, I'll introduce each briefly, then let's start the conversation off by each taking just a few minutes to describe what you would see as your most urgent and also most achievable priorities for the next few years, assuming success in the election. Dr. Tom Sherman has served in State House and State Senate for a decade or more and is now Democratic candidate for governor of New Hampshire. He was a doctor for 35 years and so has a long history of public service of various kinds. His website lists his priorities as number one, the state's housing crisis. Number two, soaring energy costs. Number three, lowering property taxes. Four, protecting public schools. And five, codifying Roe v. Wade into New Hampshire statutes. Welcome, Dr. Sherman. Then we have Senator David Waters, actually Senator Dr. David Waters, just a different kind of doctor. Senator Waters was professor of English literature at UNH and has literally an encyclopedic knowledge of New England, having co-edited the Encyclopedia of New England. He has served in the Senate since 2012. Over the years, he has sat on Energy and Natural Resources Committee, on the Capital Budget Committee, where he's been chair, and on the Senate Transportation Committee, and he's been chair and vice chair of that committee. And last, but certainly not least, we welcome Representative Kat McGhee, who is a relative newcomer compared with the two veterans, but has already been very active in her 2 years in the House. Rep. McGhee has served on the Science, Technology, and Energy Committee and has introduced and sponsored quite a plethora of energy and environment-related bills, including bills on EVs, offshore wind, community power, net metering. And she was the sole sponsor of one bill that was very intriguing to a biologist such as myself, which passed, I believe, with strong bipartisan support, namely HB 318, which last year proclaimed the daring jumping spider, Phidippus audax to be the state spider of New Hampshire. This amazing beast is described as hairy, less than an inch long, with black and white stripes and iridescent jaws, and it can jump 4 times its own body length. So that was an interesting bill from Representative McGhee. We also have with us several co-moderators who very kindly agreed to participate in this event by asking a few of their favorite environment, energy, and climate questions and following up with the principal speakers. And we'll also have plenty of time for questions from the audience. And we've already received some. Please drop your questions in the chat, and my coordinators will field them. All right, so Dr. Sherman, I'd like to start by asking you to catch us up briefly on what would be your first priorities if you're elected to the corner office in just a few minutes.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me. There are, when almost nothing has happened for 6 years, there's a lot of catching up to do. First of all, my hat goes off to David Waters and Kat McGhee, who are champions. David has done amazing work, and I served with him in transportation, and my learning curve was incredibly steep under the teachings of the professor, and learned a huge amount just working with him over the last 2 terms. And of course, Kat has been in the House for 2 terms as well, and is just a force over on her side. Unfortunately, in the minority. Otherwise, we would see all sorts of movement forward, I think, on this, as long as Sununu is no longer governor. So there's an awful lot in my book. I think there's an awful lot of low-hanging fruit. And one of the problems is that there's sort of 2 levels of pushback. One level of pushback is in the legislature. The other level of pushback is in PUC and Department of Education. I'm sorry, Department. Well, that's another problem, but the Department of Energy. So some of the areas that I think we could move very rapidly with are on efficiency and weatherization. As I'm sure everybody on this call knows, New Hampshire Saves was torpedoed. We need to turn it back to the robust initiative that it was originally. And so that would be one goal. We tried to do some work on efficiency and weatherization before the winter during the veto session. David and I and Rebecca Perkins-Quokka really sort of led on sponsoring an amendment that would have provided $10 million of funding for low-income folks for efficiency and weatherization, with the goal of getting some of that done before this winter because of the cost of energy right now. Certainly, gosh, there's so much. Just to give a broad brush, I would push to lift the caps on solar, wind, and hydro. I would expedite offshore wind development. David and I were talking about it this morning, about the idea of getting procurement through so that we could be taking advantage of that. I was kind of floored that during our debate today, the governor thought we would have to wait until 2025 to do anything with procurement for offshore wind. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. So those are just some low-hanging fruit, but you know, there is so much we could be doing. David was teaching me about use of electric buses and putting together a fleet, starting with a pilot project. And I don't want to steal your wind, so to speak, David, but having a bus fleet that would be electric, that would be able to be a resource for reverse charging, so that we would have that as a storage capacity. Just so many different initiatives. I think in terms of priorities, the way I would look is, how do we make sure people are able to tolerate the costs and what they're facing right now? So I think of the quickest and most effective ways to move forward with efficiency and weatherization as quickly as possible. And it, as all of the people on this call know, that doesn't just impact on winter and the cold months. It impacts on the summer when people are needing to be air conditioned. But I also think we could move quickly with caps, lifting the caps. I think we could move quickly with Kat in the House and David in the Senate on procurement, and those would be probably the fastest that we could move forward. And I'll be interested in hearing what David and Kat say, because I may be missing something, but those would be sort of the low-hanging fruit that we could move forward with as quickly as possible.
Great. Well, thanks very much. Senator Waters, what do you
Why
what would you add to that?
don't you let Kat go? How about that? Huh?
Sure.
There's 400 in the House. They take priority over just a few senators. What do you think, Kat?
Oh, sweet. Well, then I get to be a rose between two thorns, right? Sure, I'll go. It's interesting as I listen to Tom talk, my background's in project management, and I think one of the banes of my existence in the House is that we had a plan when I first started paying attention to New Hampshire's energy strategy. And although it wasn't as aggressive as some other states, we definitely were moving on managing via the RPS, on getting everyone on the same page. And there's a certain inertia that it takes to create a system that actually works. And that's the thing that is upsetting to me, is that what we are losing during this administration's administration of our energy sector is the very things that will allow us to move fast. We did that emergency bill at the beginning of this year to try and save the New Hampshire Saves program. But what we were hearing from the small weatherization companies was these jobs are going to go away and there's going to be nobody that can do this work. So it's the whole system for this transition that, as a legislature, we, with Tom in the corner office, we could pay attention to looking at, starting with weatherization. But then I remember the portfolio pie that Meredith Hatfield used to use in the Office of Energy Planning. And so you would look at each sector and you would say, what do we want to do in that sector, right? What do we want to do with biomass? Because now we've heard, after the biomass plants were closed in 2019, that 2023 is the year of biomass, because the Republicans realized they kind of screwed that up. The thing that's sort of on the horizon right now, besides the offshore wind project, which is moving apace without us really at the table, at least according to the regional people I talked to on a recent wind farm tour, and that's a sort of a missed opportunity that we would gain if we were back in the House and in the majority, in the House and the Senate, in the congressional, majority, is that we would, I think, go back to planning in a more strategic way rather than the scattershot way that we have to work under Republicans, which is we try to get something and make the argument for one thing. I mean, the chair of my committee told me that EVs were a fad, and I drive to Concord in an electric car, and I'm like, we're just not on the same page at all. So the idea of, we've got federal dollars coming in, are they going to get well spent on what we're trying to do in terms of our transition? All of that is in the balance in terms of who's in control. And then the thing I'm sure David is going to talk about, because I talked to Mike Licata at Eversource after you talked to Mike Licata at Eversource, and he said, David Waters brought up the same idea. I was talking to him about how we get to a place where we could, have folks be able to swap out their dumb meters for smart meters to sort of help us in a distributed way to transition the equipment so that we could do transactional, electric to get it, back and forth. So, I mean, what we really need to do is we need to work together to figure out a plan to get us to an infrastructure that actually takes us into the 21st century. And none of that is happening now. So I will leave it there, but I'm a big picture person. So I take all the pieces and try to figure out, if it was everything I wanted it to be, what would it look like? So I think we have a lot of work to do. And I think what we need is more simpatico people who believe that government actually has a role to play in this transition rather than every man for himself. So that's what I'm working on.
Thank you, Kat.
You're welcome.
Senator Waters, what do you think?
Well, thank you so much, Reinmar, and really thanks to the whole group for the opportunity to speak with such a thoughtful group, and really to have a good conversation. And one thing I'd like to just start out by saying is that having served with Tom closely for a number of years, I want people to understand that he will be the strongest environmental governor that New Hampshire has ever had. And he knows issues well, but also takes the big picture. And I think in particular, what's inspiring about Tom is the way he has looked at the public health as the overarching concern related to the climate crisis. And that drove a commission he had a couple of years ago. Rob Werner was instrumental in that, and understanding what the costs are to our human health as well as our environmental health because of the climate crisis. And it's that kind of thinking that we could have. And I just say, look at states around us. When they got a governor in the governorship who believed on working these things, planned ahead, and had a vision of our future, suddenly huge things happen. Look at Maine over the last year and a half. Look at the southern New England states. So it's important. And I think it's important to recognize that we have a team. And anything I mention is really what Tom and Kat and others know we can do and we can do together. Now, I'll just say a couple words about environmental goals that I have. I have a lot of other things I work on as well, but in particular here, I mean, the climate crisis and decarbonization is the overriding interest because it really does affect the health and the future of this state. And so to address that, I think we do have to look at clean energy and transitioning away from carbon fuels. The biggest opportunity here is offshore wind. I'm chair of that commission. I think we are poised to make a lot of progress. We are far behind the other states. But this is the only way forward for us. The first phase, 3 to 5 gigawatts, that's 3 Seabrooks. That's $3 to $5 billion construction job, $12 to $15 billion supply chain, thousands of jobs. And this is going to have the first auctions in 2024, which is basically tomorrow. We also, though, need to transform our transmission system so we can onshore that power and upgrade the transmission system so we can handle that new renewable and cheap energy, probably a third of the cost of what we're paying now for gas-powered energy. But we need to be able to get that and then also deal with the new distributed energy of solar and what we're going to do with EVs and buildings and so on. So these are important things. I'd add to that as well that another big picture issue is going to be hydrogen infrastructure. It's likely that a lot of the offshore wind turbines will be producing hydrogen. It's a storage fuel. I think it's likely they'll be using clean hydrogen to power interstate trucking because I don't think electric will work for that. It also can run turbines in manufacturing. And so we need to have that infrastructure ready. There's a lot of money in the IRA bill, tens of billions of dollars for this. And again, New Hampshire is kind of stuck and not interested in the future. So coming down from that, energy efficiency is just has to be key. That's the cheapest way to reduce our energy costs, and it also can help low-income folks. And then electrifying our transportation system, I think, is the next thing that can be the low-hanging fruit. We can move much more quickly on electric vehicle infrastructure and providing incentives. I'd say another area, though, I did want to get into in terms of the environmental crisis is what's happening to our coasts with sea level rise, with harmful algal blooms, ocean acidification, which is really the existential crisis that might destroy the food chain in our oceans. It's already having dramatic effects on shellfish, on shrimp, lobster, and finfish. And then also PFAS. And we have to have clean water. What's more important to families to have clean water? I did get the bill passed to create a $50 million bond fund so we can help municipalities and private well owners to deal with PFAS, but this is related to the landfill issue as well. And I did get the 10-year landfill, solid waste reduction and recycling plan passed, but we need to be much more aggressive than that. But again, we've been held back dramatically by the governor, who's unwilling to really try to stop half of our solid waste we're disposing in this state coming from out of state. Other states have banned it. So, I think this is why all these environmental and energy issues are so interconnected, because it all goes to the same thing. What is our future going to be for our children? And we know that if we have a Democratic legislature and we have a Democratic governor, we will get this done. We've gotten a lot done even under opposition, but we will get this done, and New Hampshire will be a better and healthier place for it.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Senator Waters. I'm wondering whether I could pick up on one thing that you mentioned, which is the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. I think a lot of our members are wondering, what exactly is the situation? What are the plans? What does the timeline look like for using some of that money? We hear about that there's a lot of money there for potentially for climate issues. What does it look like in our state from your perspective? And maybe Dr. Sherman, we could start with you on that.
Well, Tom, do you want to jump in first on that?
Sure. First of all, I want to second what David said. As a doctor, my two hats, the doctor and the senator hats, the work there's this really compelling work that's being done, and we tried to do with the Emissions Commission, as Rob and David know, but it's being done by this sort of grassroots group of healthcare workers creating the Healthcare Workers for Climate Action. And I think it started in New Hampshire in many ways. Bob Friedlander pulled this together. And the reason why it's so important to bring up here is twofold. One is it does move forward with the part that I was working on with the Emissions Commission, which is this link between healthcare and climate. But it also captures a group of people who are not on board with the science of climate and climate change, and it makes it tangible and real for them. And so there were studies that came out of Virginia that you probably know that showed that when you make that connection between climate and health, all of a sudden you get another whole entire cohort of people to get on board with the idea this is something that we need to take action on. So I think the work is absolutely spectacular that they're doing. I sit on the advisory board, but I give all the credit to all the people who are doing all that hard work. It's really amazing. They're becoming a national model, but the work they've done in New Hampshire is really critical. Getting back to the Inflation Reduction Act, the part that is so disturbing to me is we are the only state in New England that doesn't have a greenhouse gas emissions goal. And that may make it harder for us to capture some of the investment money that's coming out of the Inflation Reduction Act. So I was thinking about that as, you were asking, what do we need to move forward with? We need to move forward with some of these things right now or on November 9th, because we have to make sure they're in place as quickly as possible so we can be a part of the process of having the federal government investment in our efforts on climate and being ahead of the game. We have so much catch up to do, but some of it is just so fundamental, which is the way I think of that. And I'd be interested in what David and Kat think, but that would be a very high priority, is to make sure we've crossed all our T's, dotted all our I's, so we are eligible for that investment money coming from Washington.
Yeah.
Right now, my understanding is we may not even be eligible for it. And, we have a governor who keeps dropping the ball. 19 million for housing assistance, 800,000 for hungry children, you name it, the ball's been dropped on it. And this is something, this is a lot of money. And I guarantee you that Jean Shaheen, Maggie Hassan, Chris Pappas, and Annie Custer are going to do a great job of representing New Hampshire and making sure we get our fair share of it. But if we don't have those fundamentals in place, I'm worried that we might not even be eligible. So I'd love to hear if David and Kat share that concern.
Yeah, I'll just jump in for a second, Tom. And that the reason I wanted to turn to you first is because the IRA Act really represents the Tom Sherman vision, because it has, almost $300 billion for prescriptions, and then the Affordable Care Act extension. But wisely, it combines those health things with recognition of what we have to do on climate. And it has, tens of billions for hydrogen development, tens of billions for offshore wind. It wants to reduce carbon emissions in the electricity sector by 40%. And, by 2030, what an ambitious goal. So that means everything from EV infrastructure to offshore wind to cleaner power generation to energy efficiency work. And Tom is absolutely right that a lot of these incentives are going to be for states that are, that are right up there with basically projects ready to go and investments ready to make. So the potential is huge, and we're going to get some of that money. We are going to get some of it, but here's the damage of not having a governor who plans proactively, directs his agencies to work with the federal partners so that when they're ready to have and a lot of his grant funding, see, some just is going to come straight out to the states. Here's your piece of it in New Hampshire, but then a lot of it is going to be grant competition. And that's why you've got to show that, you got skin in the game, you got a track record. So Kat, I know you've got things to say on this one too, but
No, I'm all ears whenever you talk, David. And the only thing I would add is I'm on the Energy Efficiency and Sustainable Energy Board, the stakeholder group that has 2 members of the House appointed by the Speaker, and myself and Chairman Bose are those members. We had a meeting last Friday, and we had Governor Shaheen's person come in and give us a review of sort of the overall pieces that we could expect in terms of energy and what would be related to energy efficiency and sustainable energy for the state. And what was interesting was I was sitting next to one of the governor's people, and he was playing Candy Crush while she was giving the presentation. It was the first time I was in the room for a while. And I only say that because it lets you understand that, I think we have a lot of folks who really don't know what to do. They don't know how to do this job. And that is not the place you want to be in at a time like this, because the federal government is giving us an incredible opportunity by supplying money. One of the things we discussed was funding for heat pumps to help people convert the thermal energy that is so expensive for people to convert and to get off of oil burners and that sort of thing. So a transition plan we definitely need, and then the leadership to execute it. But I was thinking the same thing when I was in the room as to what you just said, David, which is that there will be money that we will just get, and there will be money that we can apply for and earn. There are people on the EASY board who were around for the Recovery Act money under Obama, who had extensive experience with when a tranche of money comes to help you solve a certain thing or to invest in infrastructure, that sort of thing. And you just get the feeling that those people are sort of hemorrhaging out of the agencies, because they're few and far between. And so there is a concern, if we don't get back into the majority soon, that just like I was discussing the attrition that can happen in other essential sectors of the economy, the same thing can happen in the government, that we're gutted of people who actually know how to do this work and know how to be government. And so, that is a fundamental difference. And when you're trying to do something as large as address a climate crisis and make a transition in your energy system and make sure your grid's reliable and people don't die from that kind of negligence, there are a lot of steps in energy, and to have, again, that scattershot approach where we'll do what we can and we'll take credit for everything, but we're not really able to explain to you what we're doing. Or just as David ran down a list of, the sort of the futuristic stuff that we could be moving towards that's above the basics, that stuff isn't happening. So we do run a risk of not capitalizing on the IRA money as we could. And I feel like New Hampshire did that with the ARPA money as well. So anyway, but
yeah, well, I just want to follow up just very briefly on that, because I'm still curious, how you see the relative power to act in terms of distribution and decision making about how these important funds and monies will be used. How much is up to states to decide, and how much is going to be essentially dictated from the federal level? Because if there isn't a majority of people who are sympathetic to these issues, is that going to create a huge problem in the distribution and use of IRA funds?
short answer, yes.
Well, I mean, just a couple words on this. Look, if we have Tom in the governor's office, he can crack the whip on the agencies and it gets done.
Right.
Otherwise, what the legislature can do is that we can pass bills, because we're the policy body, that instructs agencies to do things, including the PUC. And so that may be necessary. With any federal funding, the stuff that's coming to the states and the grant program, they have to write the rules and the regulations, and that process is still ongoing with a lot of this IRA money. But some of it will come down, but then the rules will come down as well, and then we can work with the agencies to figure out how best to spend that. I do think, though, that the question about whether the majority of the funding is going to be in grants, and if we are, ready and able and have set up, for example, have set up funds, have set up procedures for selection and evaluation of projects, and we can do that kind of thing by legislation. So that's the role that next year is going to be about a lot of this. About a lot of these things. And, I think one example is the EV charging infrastructure. We got the Volkswagen money 6 years ago, like everybody else. The governor, typical lip service, said, oh yeah, I want to put the maximum EV charging. And that's fine. I'm glad he said that. But then we have sat there for 4 years. I had my commission. We got the priorities, the maps, everything ready. All the other states around us spent the money, built the charging infrastructure. We might see the first contract go out sometime in the next month for New Hampshire.
I noticed that there was a
worry
press
about how
release.
we're gonna spend the 17 million that we're getting. I did set up a fund in the DOT and gave some rules in a bill to the commissioner, which and that bill passed, and so there we are. But if the governor is not pushing these things, they don't happen. And I tell you that the EPA and other places look at us. If we haven't spent the money, they say, why would we give you more?
Right.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in for 1 second. There's a fundamental difference in leadership style between me and Chris Sununu, and it stems from the way I tend to do things, but it also stems from having been in the House and the Senate. Chris Sununu, and he said it today in our debate, he says it's the legislature's responsibility to do these things and give them to him to sign or not sign. I see a completely different role for leadership in the governor's office, which is I sit down with the legislative leaders and we say, here are our goals together. Let's craft the legislation that actually achieves those goals. Let's make sure that at the very beginning, it's something that really is going to be effective. Let's usher it through together. When it comes out at the end, it needs to be something I can sign and actually addresses the problem. And by the way, then I'm not done, because then it's going to my agencies that I'm supposed to be making sure they get it get it done. So it's not about me, it's about process. And that process, that's what Kat was talking about. That process, really, the leadership comes from the governor sitting down and saying to everybody, let's all come together, let's all move forward in a direction that actually addresses the problems. And not only is that something where we can expedite bills that need to be expedited, we can really move together. It's just not leaving things up to chance. It's a very deliberate way of leading. But then it also means that I'm accountable when the bill comes out as statute. I will be accountable for making sure it actually happens. And we've seen that over and over again with this governor. I'm not being political. I can give you probably 10 examples where the opportunity has been there and just sat. Mm-hmm. And people have, on the healthcare side, people have been hurt because it's sat, because it's an effective tool that's not being implemented. On the climate side, we can't afford to let any of this sit. We have to move forward as quickly as we can, especially when health is important, but also when federal dollars depend on us doing a lot of catch up as quickly as we can, so we can be eligible for this kind of funding.
Great, thanks. I want to give the opportunity for Rob Werner to ask a question or two. Rob is, as many people know here, a New Hampshire State Director of League of Conservation Voters, and I'm sure he has some interesting points to bring up.
I do, thanks. Good to be with you all. And a quick comments before I ask a question. One, I'm very worried about the attitude of the governor and the Department of Energy and the Department of Transportation and the folks there in terms of their interest in pursuing these federal monies. We've heard that, well, we don't have the staff capacity to do it, perhaps, or we've heard maybe more nefarious aspects of, well, we ideologically disagree with this kind of massive investment and spending of government money. So because we disagree with it from an ideological point of view, perhaps we won't be taking advantage of it. Mm-hmm. So, we have to watch out for these things. And I do think there's a role for the legislature to step in and push, but I hope that we have a pro-environment majority in both houses that will make that even more possible. One quick thing in the IRA, the Climate Mayors Group, which I think many of you are familiar with, on Friday, we'll be releasing a very detailed but understandable, and they stress understandable, document roadmap for municipalities, for mayors and city councilors and anybody else involved in municipal government to understand what the programs are, to the extent that we can do it. As David had pointed out, there's still regs being written, but what are the processes that are expected? Where's money going? And maybe some of the questions that have been raised could be answered. That's coming out on Friday, and it should be hopefully on the Climate Mayor's website on Friday. I wanted to shift a little bit to something that is of great concern, but I think misunderstanding to many of our residents, which is, why are our electric bills so high? Why are our energy costs so high? Why are they historically high? And why are they now? And I can assure you, it's not simply because we did not pursue the Keystone Pipeline. It is not for a variety of other things like that you hear from the other side on the campaign trail. It's much more complicated than that. That's very simplistic, but maybe sounds good to some people. So I guess what I'm looking for is an explanation that is really understandable from a political point of view, as well as a policy point of view, but really more from a political point of view. Why are our costs so high, and what can we do about it?
That's a great question, Rob. And I want to just interject that we actually have, the network has an event tomorrow evening at, I believe, 7. Is that correct? folks? Yeah, at 7. Being
5:30.
led by Joe.
5:30.
5:30 tomorrow afternoon. It's being led by Joe Kwasnick, and we'll answer or try to answer a lot of those questions. But I am very curious as to how our guests will respond to that. Dr. Sherman, you want to start off?
Sure. So the way I view this is that I guess in medicine, we call it multifactorial. And some of those factors we can control and some we can't at the state level. So, and David or Kat, please jump in along the way if you want to clarify, or especially if you disagree with me, because want to make sure that whatever we're presenting is as accurate as possible. But fundamentally, the sort of the part we can't control is Putin's war and what's happening in Ukraine. The other part we have difficulty controlling is COVID. So we're coming off of a pandemic that has certainly caused shifts in virtually every supply chain. And I would put out that there's also shifts in the availability of energy as a result of that, but mostly Ukraine and the need for liquid natural gas worldwide the demand has driven it up. My understanding has driven up the cost. My understanding is that this has very little to do with pipeline issues. It has very little to do with ability to bring liquid natural gas to New Hampshire. It really has to do with the underlying supply. And so that's the part that I don't think we can control. The part that we can control or could have controlled is not having so much dependence on fossil fuels, whether that's oil or natural gas. But really, had we expanded our energy portfolio back when all those bills were in front of the governor, almost all, actually all of them passed. They were strongly bipartisan back mostly in 2019. There was one in 2018 before I was in the Senate. And those had to do with net metering, RGGI, efficiency, pretty much across the board. And they were all vetoed. And what we have been left with is a much smaller ability to actually produce our own energy, for people to produce their own energy, for companies to produce their own energy. And so unlike a state like Maine or Massachusetts, we are much more dependent on fossil fuels and on the grid rather than being dependent on locally produced energy. So I think some of the promising in terms of and sorry, I think the other part that would have put us in a much better place had we embraced efficiency and weatherization. We all remember the shock back in, I think it was March of 2021, but correct me if I'm wrong, David or Kat, when the PUC torpedoed New Hampshire Saves. Concord was, and Rob knows this better than anybody on this call, Concord was ready to launch one of the most ambitious efficiency programs in the history of the state, and it was torpedoed. And that put us a year behind. And what we finally came out with from the legislature to force the PUC really to move forward was significantly weaker than the original New Hampshire Saves program. So if you think of where we would be right now, we would certainly still have an increase in our energy costs, but we would have a broader portfolio of energy to draw from rather than being so dependent on fossil fuels. We would have had much more ability to have local energy, and some of that might not have been in place, but it would certainly be in the process. And we would have had weatherization and efficiency, which can be done fairly quickly especially if it had been on the original schedule of New Hampshire Saves, all of that would have had an impact. And, some of the studies out of, I believe it's out of Boston, it's a 4-year program, just shows how much those savings can be. And it's interesting, that also shows that New Hampshire had the weakest savings because we also had the weakest investment in alternative sources of energy. So that's my understanding of when I try to explain it to people. Would we have had our bills going up no matter what? Yes, because of things that are outside the state for control. But would we have been in a much better position? I believe we would have been, and I think there's lots of data that shows that, just the experience of our neighboring states.
Yeah, just to follow up on that. I mean, Tom put it exactly right. And, a couple years ago when we had spike in gas prices, the LNG came in and knocked the peaks down, but now it's going to Europe. The refineries in Texas in the 90s made a huge bet on high sulfur oil, and they spent billions to refine that. And then guess what? Fracking brings in low sulfur oil and the refineries. That's why we're sending that over to overseas, and why we're talking to Venezuela, because we get high sulfur oil from them. So a lot of big things. But, if we had efficiency, if we had as many electric vehicles as states around us, if we had as much solar, 20% of the energy and electricity being generated by solar in Massachusetts now, the price would be high for gas, yes. But you know what? You wouldn't be paying it because you'd have solar, you'd have more efficiency, low-income solar. A lot of low-income folks would have more efficient homes. They would benefited from solar energy. So the price could go up, but their bill wouldn't go up. And I think this is it's really, really deeply frustrating, but it suggests that we've got to double down and do the things that we know can prevent this from happening again. And we've got to break free from this. We've got to break free from these companies and these circumstances. And we can do that by bringing power to the people. We don't have to worry about gas if we got offshore wind or if we have solar, right? It is in our control. And we've had a governor who's resisted that at every step.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Both of you are exactly right. The other thing I was thinking that might be a point that could be made here is that I tried to provide some economic background and international economic review of what investors were doing in terms of climate around the world to our little 10-year energy strategy plan that the DOE was required by statute to redo in 2021. And they finally released it, I think, in July of 2022. But we had public comment that we were allowed to put in, and many of the people on this call supplied public comment to that effort. And when I submitted my comment, I gave a couple of suggestions for what I thought we should do high level in terms of leadership, because I thought everybody else was covering a lot of the details. But I gave this economic piece that I found in Science Magazine, which basically said that a disorderly transition is the most costly, right? And I tried to make the point that without the order of understanding what we're doing, where we're going, it's just like a company. When I spoke with the BIA, I made that point to them. I said, Sununu's not really a good governor for business because businesses have to plan. And if you need to know where you are in 5 years or 10 years, and you don't know what the state is doing, or the state is pulling the rug out of their own programs because they've got ideologues at the helm, that is not an energy sector that anybody envies, and it's not an energy sector that anybody will invest in. So to go back to the point of now there's money, there are grants. Are we eligible for them? No one can tell what New Hampshire's doing. And that puts us at a severe disadvantage for trying to leap forward.
Right. Well, thanks, folks. It's really interesting, and we could obviously go on for hours on this set of topics. We have a lot of members, and some of whom are on the call now, who are interested in working on the different issues around solid waste and plastics. And I wanted to just turn a little bit to that set of issues as well. We have questions about, the SB 367, the advanced recycling, what the wisdom of that so-called advanced recycling of plastics would be. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about what plans would be potentially forthcoming in terms of how New Hampshire can kind of start to get a handle on the increasing problem of plastic waste in the environment.
I am going to let David lead on this unless Kat wants to. I have lots of thoughts on waste, but I think we have an expert here, and so I would defer to David.
Well, thank you, Tom, and Kat, jump into it. I was involved in the 367, and I think we're really, I think we need to take a lot of different approaches. We are all looking to Maine and to Oregon, and I had hoped California, but maybe not, but certainly to Washington, who are doing extended producer responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
So that if you bring trash, and particularly plastic, into a state, you're responsible for recycling it, paying for that, and making sure that you're transitioning away from plastic and reducing the virgin plastic in products. New Hampshire's not going to do that yet. And I think we have to, Maine is just getting implemented. I think this is the way everybody's going to go, maybe even at the federal level if the Break Free from Plastics bill finally passes. In the meantime, we have a problem. What are we going to do with the plastic? It's got PFAS in it. It should not go into landfills. We're having trouble with recycling. So when this concept came forward about the advanced recycling, a couple of things. First, we made sure it was not going to be producing fuel. And second, made sure that it was going to be reduced into stock that could be put back into plastic production. Now, I know there's a problem. Is this just create a circular plastic economy? I talked to Democratic legislators, a Democratic legislature in Virginia and a couple other states went along with this because they saw it potentially filling a niche. And one thing about it is that they're really hard to recycle plastics. Think about the big heavy plastic toys and other things like that, which have no other use, that these potentially can do that. I also made sure that we could get inside the factory. The DES could get in there, even though we were saying it's a manufacturing facility. The DES can get inside, not just outside, to monitor what's going on. Will one of these be built in New Hampshire? I don't know. It's complicated. I know Sierra Club and other groups are unhappy about it. I think partly because they're thinking of the bills that were introduced to turn us the stuff into fuel on Rhode Island and elsewhere. And I am always willing to say, as David Souter once told me, that it's carved over some Greek building. Before you enter it, consider you may be wrong. And if that's the case, then we're going to have to fix the bill or do something about it. But I'm sorry to go on about it, but it's a tough one. It's a tough one, and it maybe is because we're in such desperate straits about what to do about plastic.
And is there any chance of extended producer responsibility moving forward at all? Well, obviously, if we change majorities and so forth in the corner office, then there is. But if it doesn't, then what's the situation look like?
What do you think, Kat? What are we going to do?
Not in the current constitution of the House, no. I just have to say, since I've been in the State House, we've had quite a number of efforts on plastics bills and waste bills. And I remember that we had a bill that I thought was eminently reasonable because it was basically optional banning of single-use plastics for towns that wanted to do that. And I thought that'll go in New Hampshire, right? Because there's, Peterborough is not the same as, Claremont or whatever, but nope, they wouldn't even let that go through. So it's a very, it's a strange recalcitrant kind of thing that, because I've listened to hearings on these bills. I think to David's point, it's complex and there are, things to know in terms of the science and the air you know, the effects of if you're going to be burning something, what's going to happen. I think folks are rightly skeptical and concerned about that, and the House and the Senate need to become better educated. But I think we need to have, you know, fully transparent, open hearings and figure out what's the right way to go. And I think doing the research of looking at how it's being handled in other places is always helpful and illuminating as well, because it is a difficult problem.
And I think, you know, Kat, I think that, you know, we're a small market, small state.
Yep.
If, you know, Maine is pretty small too, but look, if Connecticut and New York go to EPR, which they may well pretty soon, then the waste companies themselves and manufacturers say, look, we've got to, we can't have this piecemeal. We've got to,
Yeah.
do it. Second, we do have the 10-year plan, which requires substantial reduction for that period of time, which is going to involve recycling. And I'm going to reintroduce my bill to create a tipping fee structure on out-of-state waste, and that money is going to be directed towards you know, processing facilities, recycling, waste reduction. So, you know, there are things that we can do, but
David, I would just add one more, which is that in the short term, we have to be sure that we are containing the contamination. That's why I think, you know, I've been involved in PFAS dissemination through Coakley since 2014. So it's been something I've worked on. I put in bills on drinking water. You had mentioned that earlier, to set our state standards, which were among the tightest in the country. After that, we're learning so much more coming out of the EPA. Finally, they're working on it. But I think the most important thing we should be doing right now, while we're doing all those other things, is making sure that when we dispose of it, basically long-term storage, which is right now in landfills, that those are as secure as they possibly can be. And we all know that we were working on the what was it, 1454, where we were trying to get that balance, and the governor, of course, vetoed that. So we have to make sure that however we store this waste, that it is not going to contaminate the environment, people's groundwater, drinking water, or pristine lakes and rivers nearby. And I think that's something we should just set as the immediate bar.
Great. Well, thanks. You know, folks, we have to end. An hour is much shorter than I thought it was. And I want to apologize to a few people that I invited that we haven't gotten time to turn to them for questions. But and there's a lot of questions also from our membership. We'll try to answer some of them via emails. And I want to reiterate that anybody who's interested in why our energy bills are high and what we can do about it, please join us tomorrow at 5:30 p.m. and we'll find out some of the details, and we'll get into that. And so, folks, I really want to thank all three, Representative McGhee, Senator Waters, and Senator Dr. Sherman. I guess you're still senator at the moment. Is that right?
Yeah. Right. I also have to apologize that I won't be able to be there tomorrow night at 5:30. I will be in my 5th of 6 debates tomorrow night. So
right.
I'm sorry I won't be able to be there joining you all, but no, I'm with you in spirit.
That was one of the conflicts, and it is going to be recorded. The debates are going to be recorded, and our event will also be recorded. So one way or another, people can hear both if they are so inclined. So thank you so much again, and we hope all for the we hope for the best. We've got our fingers crossed for everybody, and we hope to see you again very soon. Thanks everybody.
Thanks, Reinmar.
Thank you for having